The woman the town erased. They dragged her through the street like garbage, barefoot, bleeding, silent. Lydia Hale didn't scream. She'd learned years ago that pain only entertained them longer. The men gripped her arms hard enough to bruise, their boots kicking up dust that coated her torn skirt, and the town watched from porches and doorways with the same empty stares they'd given her for months. No one moved. No one spoke. She was already gone to them. But two small girls stepped into the road, looked those men in the eye, and said no. And everything stopped. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Lydia's story can travel. And if it grabs you, hit that like button and stay until the end. You won't regret it. The Wyoming sun had no mercy in late August. It bore down on the town of Ember Crossing like a hammer on an anvil, flattening shadows and baking the dirt roads until they cracked. Lydia Hale felt every degree of it through the thin soles of her boots, or what was left of them. The leather had split weeks ago, held together now by strips of cloth she'd torn from her own petticoat. She walked carefully, heel to toe, trying not to disturb the blisters that wept beneath the makeshift bandages. She kept her head down as she moved along the edge of Main Street, her arms wrapped around a bundle of soiled linens she'd collected from the boarding house. Mrs. Carmichael had stopped paying her 3 weeks ago, but Lydia still came for the laundry. It gave her something to do, somewhere to go, a reason to be vertical. The women on the boardwalk didn't look at her directly. They never did. But she felt their eyes slide past her like oil on water. She heard the whispers, too. Always the whispers. Still here. Thought she'd have moved on by now. No shame left in that one. Lydia's fingers tightened on the bundle, but her face remained blank. She'd perfected that expression over the past 2 years. Smooth, empty, untouchable. It was the only armor she had left. She turned down the alley behind the general store, where a rain barrel sat in the shade. The water inside was old and filmy, but it was free, and she didn't have to ask permission. She set the linens on the ground and knelt beside the barrel, dipping her hands into the tepid water. The coolness was a brief relief. She splashed her face, her neck, the inside of her wrists. For a moment, she closed her eyes. For a moment, she let herself remember what it felt like to be clean. You still using that barrel, Lydia? She opened her eyes. Arnold Dutch stood at the mouth of the alley, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. He owned the general store, and he'd made it clear months ago that she wasn't welcome inside. I'll be done in a minute, she said quietly. That's what you said last week. He stepped closer, his boots scraping against the packed dirt. And the week before that? Lydia rose slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt. I'm not bothering anyone. You're bothering me. He gestured toward the barrel. That's my water, my property, and I'm tired of you treating this town like it owes you something. I'm not. You are. His voice sharpened. You walk around here like some kind of ghost, taking up space, using things that don't belong to you. You got no husband, no home, no reason to be here. Why don't you just move on? Because I have nowhere to go. She didn't say it. There was no point. Arnold Dutch didn't care where she went, only that she left. I'll find somewhere else to wash, she said. See that you do. He turned and walked back toward the street, leaving her standing in the alley with the bundle of laundry at her feet and the sun pressing down on her shoulders like a hand. She picked up the linens and kept walking. By the time Lydia reached the creek at the edge of town, her legs were shaking. She hadn't eaten since yesterday, a half-burned biscuit she'd found behind the bakery, and the heat was making her head swim. She knelt on the bank and dunked the linens into the water, scrubbing them with a sliver of lye soap she'd saved from a job 3 months ago. The repetitive motion steadied her. Scrub, rinse, wring. Scrub, rinse, wring. Her hands moved automatically, and her mind drifted. She thought about Samuel. Not the way he'd been at the end, thin and gray and coughing blood into his hands, but the way he'd been before, strong, laughing. The kind of man who could fix a wagon wheel with one hand and pull her into a dance with the other. They'd had 3 years together. 3 years of a small house on the north edge of town, a garden that produced more squash than they could eat, and a hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd have a child before long. Then the fever came. It took Samuel in less than a week. Took the house 6 months later when she couldn't pay the taxes. Took her standing in town when the rumors started. Rumors that she'd been seen with other men, that she'd driven Samuel to an early grave with her coldness, that she was cursed. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter when people had already decided who you were. She wrung out the last sheet and laid it across the grass to dry. Her hands were raw, her knuckles cracked and bleeding in places. She dipped them in the creek and watched the blood swirl away in the current. A shadow fell across the water. Lydia looked up. 3 men stood on the bank above her. She recognized 2 of them, Arnold Deutsch and Carl Miner, who ran the livery. The third was younger, maybe 20, with a patchy beard and a mean smile. "Told you she'd be here," Arnold said. Lydia got to her feet slowly. "I'm just washing linens." "On public land," Carl added, "using public water. The creek belongs to everyone." "Not to you." Arnold stepped closer. "We've been talking, Lydia. Folks in town. And we're all in agreement. You've overstayed your welcome." Her pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You exist," the younger man said. "That's enough," Carl chuckled. "Come on now. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Just pack up whatever you got and head out. There's other towns, other places for women like you. Women like me. Widows with no family, no skills, no prospects." Arnold's smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're a drain on this town, Lydia, and we're done carrying you." "I'm not asking anyone to carry me." "Then leave." "No." The word came out before she could stop it. Quiet, but firm. It hung in the air between them like a spark over dry grass. Arnold's smile vanished. "What did you say?" "I said no." Lydia's hands curled into fists at her sides. "I have as much right to be here as anyone." "You got no rights." Carl moved to her left, cutting off her path back toward town. "You got no husband, no house, no money. You're nobody." The younger man stepped to her right. Lydia's heart hammered against her ribs. "Don't." Arnold reached for her arm. "You should have left when we asked nice." She jerked back, stumbling on the uneven ground. Her heel caught on a root and she went down hard, her palms scraping against the rocks. Pain flared up her wrists, bright and sharp. "Get up," Arnold said. She didn't move. "I said get up." Hands grabbed her, rough, impatient, and hauled her to her feet. She tried to pull away, but Carl's grip was iron. The younger man took her other arm, and together they dragged her forward. "Let go of me." "Should have thought of that before you got stubborn," Arnold said. They pulled her through the grass, past the drying laundry, onto the road. Her feet scraped against the dirt, her toes catching on stones. She twisted, tried to plant her heels, but they were too strong, too determined. People appeared in doorways, on porches, at windows. No one moved. No one spoke. Lydia stopped struggling. What was the point? She'd learned this lesson before. Resistance only fed them. Silence starved them faster. So she went limp. Let them drag her. Let them prove what they were. The men hauled her down Main Street, her skirt tearing, her arms burning. Dust coated her face, filled her mouth. She tasted copper and dirt and defeat. And then, stop. The voice was small, clear, unafraid. The men slowed. Lydia lifted her head. 2 girls stood in the middle of the road. One was maybe 8, the other closer to 6. Both wore faded calico dresses and had dark braids pinned neatly at the napes of their necks. The older one had her arms crossed. The younger one held a rag doll. "Move aside, girls," Arnold said. "No," the older one said. Carl laughed. "You don't understand what's happening here." "Yes, I do." The girl stepped forward. Her eyes, gray and steady, met Arnold's without flinching. "You're hurting her." "We're removing a problem." "She's not a problem, she's a person." "Clara." A man's voice, low and even, came from behind the crowd. "June." The girls didn't move. The crowd parted. A man stepped into the road. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and a face weathered by wind and work. He wore a simple shirt and trousers, both clean but worn, and his boots were scuffed at the toes. He didn't look at Arnold or Carl or the younger man. He looked at Lydia. "Let her go," he said. Arnold's grip tightened. "This isn't your business, Crowley." "It is now." Ethan Crowley moved with the kind of calm that made nervous men fidget. He stepped past Clara and June, stopped 3 feet from Arnold, and waited. She's got no place here, Carl said. Then she'll come with us. Arnold blinked. What? You heard me. Ethan's gaze didn't waver. Let her go. You don't even know her. Don't need to. She's trouble. So I've heard. Ethan looked at Lydia then, and something in his expression, something soft and sure, made her chest ache. Ma'am, would you like to come with us? Lydia stared at him, at the girls, at the steady, impossible calm in his eyes. She should say no. Should tell him not to waste his kindness on someone the town had already buried. Should save him the trouble of being tied to her name. But the word that came out was yes. Ethan extended his hand. Arnold released her arm. Lydia stepped forward, her legs unsteady, and placed her hand in Ethan's. His grip was warm, solid, real. He didn't pull her, didn't rush her, just held her hand and waited until she was ready to walk. Clara and June fell into step beside them. The crowd watched in silence as they moved down the road, past the general store, past the boarding house, past the church with its whitewashed walls and judgmental bell. No one followed. No one spoke. And for the first time in 2 years, Lydia Hale walked through Ember Crossing without her head bowed. The cabin sat 3 miles north of town, nestled in a clearing where pine trees grew thick and the air smelled like sap and earth. It was small, 2 rooms, a stone chimney, a porch that wrapped halfway around the front, but it was clean, neat, cared for. Ethan helped Lydia onto the porch and gestured toward a wooden chair. Sit. She sat. Clara disappeared inside and returned with a tin cup of water. Lydia took it with shaking hands and drank. The water was cold, clean, and tasted like snow. June stood nearby, clutching her doll, watching Lydia with wide, serious eyes. Ethan knelt in front of her and examined her feet. The makeshift bandages were soaked through with blood and dirt. He frowned, but didn't comment, just stood and went inside. Clara sat on the steps. You don't have to be scared. Lydia looked at her. I'm not scared? Yes, you are. It's okay. We were too, when we first came here. Came here from where? An orphanage in Cheyenne. Clara's voice was matter-of-fact. Our parents died in a fire. We got sent there, but it was bad. Mr. Crowley came and got us last year. He adopted you? Not officially, but he says we're his. Clara tilted her head. Are you going to stay? I don't know. You should. We have an extra bed. Ethan returned with a basin of water, clean cloths, and a small jar of salve. He set them on the porch and knelt again, gently unwrapping the cloth from Lydia's feet. She winced as the fabric pulled away from the blisters. This is going to hurt, he said quietly. I know. He cleaned her feet with careful, steady hands. The water stung, but Lydia bit the inside of her cheek and stayed still. When he was done, he dried her feet and applied the salve, thick, cool, smelling faintly of lavender. Thank you, she whispered. Ethan wrapped her feet in clean bandages, then stood. You're welcome. Why did you do that? Back there, I mean. He met her eyes. Because it was wrong. People do wrong things all the time. Doesn't mean I have to stand by and watch. Lydia's throat tightened. She looked away toward the trees where the light was fading and the shadows were growing long. I don't have anything to give you, she said. No money, no skills. I didn't ask for anything. Then what do you want? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how about we start with supper? Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table sat in the center of the room and 2 narrow beds were tucked in the corner, neatly made with patchwork quilts. A third bed, larger, sat behind a curtain in the back. Clara and June set the table while Ethan stirred a pot of stew over the fire. The smell made Lydia's stomach twist with hunger, but she stayed in the chair by the door, unsure if she was allowed to move. Come sit, Ethan said, not looking up. She hesitated, then crossed the room and sat at the table. Clara handed her a wooden bowl and a spoon. June poured water from a pitcher into 4 cups. When the stew was ready, Ethan ladled it into their bowls, thick with venison, potatoes, carrots, and onions. Lydia stared at hers, her vision blurring. It's okay to eat. Clara said gently. Lydia picked up her spoon. The first bite was almost painful. The warmth, the flavor, the fullness of it. Her body didn't know what to do. She ate slowly, carefully, and no one spoke until the bowls were empty. Afterward, Ethan poured coffee, strong and bitter, and they sat in silence as the fire crackled. "You can stay as long as you need," Ethan said finally. Lydia looked at him. "Why?" "Because you need a place, and we have one." "You don't know me." "Don't need to." "What if I'm everything they said I was?" Ethan's gaze was steady. "Then you're still welcome here." Lydia's hands trembled around her cup. She set it down before she dropped it. "I won't be a burden," she said. "Didn't say you would be." "I mean it. I'll work. I'll help. I'll—" "Lydia." His voice was firm but kind. "You don't have to earn this." She stared at him, uncomprehending. "You don't have to earn being treated like a human being," he said. "You just are one. That's enough." Something inside her cracked. Not broke. Cracked. Like ice in spring. She nodded because she didn't trust her voice, and Ethan let the silence settle. That night, Lydia lay in the narrow bed across from Clara and June, staring at the ceiling beams. The quilt smelled like cedar and wood smoke. The pillow was soft. The silence was unbroken except for the occasional pop of embers in the fireplace. She hadn't slept in a bed in 6 months. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt safe. Morning came slowly to the cabin, filtered through pine branches and carried on air that smelled of dew and distant smoke. Lydia woke to the sound of water being poured, the soft clink of metal on metal, and Clara's voice humming something low and tuneless. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the weight of the quilt registered, the softness of the pillow, and the fact that her feet didn't hurt quite as badly as they had the night before. She opened her eyes. Clara stood at the wash basin near the window, braiding her hair with quick, practiced movements. June sat at the table, feeding bits of bread to her doll and whispering to it in a language only the two of them understood. The fire had been rebuilt, and a pot of something, oats maybe, bubbled gently over the coals. Ethan was nowhere to be seen. Lydia pushed herself upright, wincing as her feet touched the floor. The bandages were still clean, still tight. She tested her weight carefully, then stood. Clara glanced over. "Mr. Crowley said to let you sleep." "Where is he?" "Chopping wood. He does that every morning." Clara finished her braid and tied it off with a strip of ribbon. "There's water in the basin if you want to wash, and June set out a dress for you." Lydia looked at the foot of the bed. A simple cotton dress lay folded there, faded blue, patched at the elbows, but clean. Beside it, a pair of thick wool socks. "That's yours," Lydia said. "It doesn't fit me anymore." Clara shrugged. "June's too small for it, and you need it more than the rag pile does." Lydia picked up this dress, her fingers tracing the careful stitches in the patches. Someone had taken time with this. Someone had cared. "Thank you," she said quietly. Clara smiled. "You're welcome." Lydia washed quickly, the cold water shocking her skin into alertness, then changed into the dress. It hung loose on her frame. She'd lost weight over the past months, more than she'd realized, but it was whole. It was clean. It was hers, even if only for now. When she emerged from behind the curtain, June looked up from her doll and nodded approvingly. "You look pretty." Lydia's throat tightened. "Thank you, June." The door opened and Ethan stepped inside, his arms full of split logs. He carried them to the woodpile beside the fireplace, stacked them neatly, then brushed the bark from his sleeves. His eyes flicked to Lydia, took in the dress, and he nodded once before turning to the pot over the fire. "Oats are ready," he said. "Help yourselves." They ate at the table, the same quiet rhythm as the night before. Ethan didn't ask questions, didn't press, just ate his portion and drank his coffee and let the silence be what it was. When the bowls were empty, Clara and June cleared the table without being asked. Lydia stood, uncertain, until Ethan gestured toward the door. "Want to walk?" She hesitated. "Where?" "Just around. You've been cooped up. Thought you might like some air." Lydia glanced at her feet. The bandages were holding, and the salve had worked overnight. The pain was duller now, manageable. "All right," she said. They stepped outside into the cool morning. The sun was still low, casting long shadows across the clearing. Birds called from the trees, and somewhere in the distance a creek burbled over stones. Ethan walked slowly, his hands in his pockets, his gaze on the horizon. Lydia matched his pace, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth beginning to creep into the day. "How long have you been out here?" she asked. 4 years, built the cabin myself." He nodded toward the tree line. "There's a spring about a quarter mile that way, good water, and the hunting's decent if you know where to look." "It's quiet." "That's why I picked it." They walked in silence for a while, following a faint trail that led toward the creek. The ground was uneven, dotted with roots and stones, but Lydia found her footing. The movement felt good, purposeful. "Clara said you got them from an orphanage," she said. Ethan nodded. "Cheyenne. I was passing through, stopped to water my horse, saw them sitting on the steps, and—" He paused, his jaw tightening. "They looked like they'd been forgotten. So you took them. Asked if they wanted to come with me. They said yes." He glanced at her. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Lydia thought about the men dragging her through the street, the crowd watching, the silence. "Not everyone says yes," she said quietly. "No," Ethan agreed, "but the ones who do deserve a chance." They reached the creek, and Ethan crouched beside it, dipping his hand in the water. Lydia stood a few feet back, watching the current twist around rocks and fallen branches. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "You didn't know me, didn't owe me anything." Ethan straightened, wiping his hand on his trousers. "You needed help. A lot of people need help. Then a lot of people should be getting it." His voice was firm, but not harsh. "Just because most folks turn their backs doesn't mean it's the right thing to do." Lydia looked at him, really looked. His face was lined, his hands calloused, his shoulders broad from years of hard work, but his eyes were clear, honest. And when he looked at her, he didn't see a problem to be solved or a burden to be managed. He saw a person. "I don't know how to repay you," she said. "Don't want repayment. Everyone wants something." Ethan met her gaze. "Not from you." The words settled between them, simple and unshakable. Lydia wanted to argue, to insist that she couldn't just take without giving, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He meant it. "Come on," he said, turning back toward the cabin. "Clara's probably got June convinced they need to reorganize the pantry again." Lydia followed, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the faintest flicker of something she didn't dare name yet. Hope. Back at the cabin, Clara and June had indeed emptied half the pantry onto the table and were sorting jars by size. Ethan shook his head, smiling faintly, and left them to it. Lydia stood in the doorway, unsure where to fit into the easy rhythm they'd established. "Can I help?" she asked. Clara looked up, surprised. "You don't have to." "I know, but I'd like to." June handed her a jar of preserves. "These go on the top shelf. We keep the heavy ones lower so they don't fall." Lydia took the jar and placed it carefully where June indicated. Then another, and another. The work was simple, methodical, and it gave her hands something to do besides shake. As they worked, Clara talked about the garden they'd planted in the spring, about the deer that came to drink from the creek at dawn, about the time June had tried to catch a rabbit and ended up covered in mud. June added details in her quieter voice, and Lydia listened, letting their words fill the space around her. By midday, the pantry was reorganized, the table was cleared, and Ethan had returned with a brace of rabbits. He skinned and cleaned them outside while Lydia helped Clara prepare vegetables, carrots, onions, potatoes from the root cellar. The rhythm was familiar, comforting. Her hands remembered how to peel, how to chop, how to make something useful from raw ingredients. "You're good at that," Clara observed, watching Lydia's knife move smoothly through an onion. "I used to cook for my husband," Lydia said. The words came out before she could stop them, and she froze, waiting for the questions. But Clara just nodded. "What was his name?" "Samuel." "Did he like onions?" A laugh bubbled up, unexpected and sharp. "No, he hated them, but he ate them anyway because I put them in everything." Clara smiled. That's love, I think. Eating things you hate because someone you care about made them. Lydia's chest tightened. Yeah, I think it is. They worked in silence after that, but it wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that held space for grief without demanding explanations. When the stew was simmering and the bread was rising, Ethan came inside and washed his hands in the basin. Smells good. Clara did most of it, Lydia said. Lydia did the onions, Clara countered. Ethan glanced between them, something warm flickering in his expression. Well, good work, both of you. That night, after supper, Ethan pulled out a worn deck of cards and taught June a game that involved matching numbers and stealing piles. Clara rolled her eyes but joined in, and soon the cabin was filled with laughter, June's high and bright, Claire's lower and knowing, Ethan's rare but genuine. Lydia sat in the chair by the fire, watching. She didn't know the rules of the game, didn't try to learn. She just let the sound of their voices wash over her, let the warmth of the fire seep into her bones. This was what a home felt like. She'd almost forgotten. The days began to blur together in a way that felt less like erasure and more like rhythm. Lydia woke each morning to the sound of Ethan chopping wood, helped Clara and June with small tasks, mending, cooking, tidying, and spent the evening sitting by the fire while the girls played or read from the single battered book they owned. Her feet healed, the blisters scabbed over, then faded. The bandages came off, and she walked without limping. Ethan gave her a pair of boots, old but sturdy, that had belonged to someone he didn't talk about. They fit well enough. She didn't ask questions, didn't push, just wore the boots and kept moving forward. One afternoon, Clara found her sitting on the porch, staring at the trees. Are you sad? Lydia looked at her. Sometimes. About your husband? About a lot of things. Clara sat beside her, her legs dangling off the edge of the porch. Mr. Crowley says it's okay to be sad. He says it just means you loved something. He's right. Do you still love him, your husband? Lydia thought about it, about Samuel's laugh, his hands, the way he used to hum while he worked, about the space he'd left behind when he died, vast and aching and impossible to fill. Yes, she said, but it's different now, quieter. Clara nodded, as if that made perfect sense. I still love my parents, but it doesn't hurt as much as it used to. Does Mr. Crowley talk about them? Your parents? Only if we ask. He says grief is ours to carry, not his to manage. Clara tilted her head. But he listens, if we need him to. Lydia looked toward the cabin, where Ethan was inside fixing a broken hinge on the pantry door. He's a good man. The best, Clara said simply. That night, Lydia couldn't sleep. She lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind turning over the past weeks. She'd been here almost a month now, and Ethan hadn't asked her to leave. Hadn't asked her for anything, really. Just let her exist in the space he'd made. It was disorienting, uncomfortable, and terrifying in a way she couldn't articulate, because what happened when it ended? She rose quietly, careful not to wake Clara and June, and stepped outside. The night was cool, the stars sharp and bright overhead. She sat on the porch steps and wrapped her arms around her knees. The door opened behind her. Ethan stepped out, a blanket in his hands. He draped it over her shoulders without a word, then sat beside her. They didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Lydia said, I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop. What do you mean? This, all of this, it feels too easy, too good, like it can't possibly last. Ethan leaned back on his hands, his gaze on the sky. Why does it have to end? Because everything does. Not everything. You don't know that. No, he admitted, but I'm not planning on kicking you out if that's what you're worried about. Lydia pulled the blanket tighter. What if I can't give you anything in return? Already told you, I'm not asking for anything. But what if I want to? The words came out sharper than she intended, edged with frustration. What if I don't want to just take and take and take without giving something back? Ethan turned to look at her. Then give what you can, when you can. But don't measure it. Don't keep score. That's not how this works. How does it work? You just live, you help where you're able, you exist. That's enough. Lydia shook her head. It doesn't feel like enough. That's because you've been told it isn't. For a long time, I'd guess. His voice was gentle, but firm. Doesn't make it true. She looked at him, this man who'd stepped into the road and stopped everything with nothing more than his presence and his certainty, who'd brought 2 orphaned girls into his home and built them a life, who'd given her shelter without conditions. Why? She asked. Why do you do this? Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because I know what it's like to be thrown away. Lydia's breath caught. I was younger than Clara when my mother left me at a workhouse in St. Louis, he continued, his voice even. Said she couldn't feed me. Maybe she couldn't, I don't know. I spent 8 years there, working looms until my fingers bled, sleeping on floors, getting beaten for asking questions. When I was 16, I ran, came west, started over. He looked at her, and his eyes were steady. No one helped me, he said. No one stopped the foreman from using his belt. No one asked if I was all right. So when I see someone who needs help, I give it. Because I remember what it felt like when no one did. Lydia's throat ached. I'm sorry. Don't be. Just don't let the people who hurt you convince you that you deserved it, because you didn't. She nodded, not trusting her voice. They sat in silence after that, wrapped in the blanket and the night. And when Lydia finally went back inside, she felt something shift. Not healed, not whole, but less broken than before. The following week, a rider came. Lydia was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin when she heard the hoofbeats. She froze, her hands still gripping a damp sheet, and watched as a man in a black coat rode into the clearing. Ethan stepped out onto the porch, his expression unreadable. Can I help you? The man dismounted. He was tall, thin, with a sharp face and eyes that moved too quickly. Looking for a woman. Lydia Hale. Heard she might be staying out here. Lydia's stomach dropped. She knew that voice. Ethan's gaze flicked to her, then back to the man. Who's asking? Name's Thomas Ridley. I'm a creditor from Ember Crossing. Mrs. Hale owes money on property taxes from a house she used to own. I'm here to collect. Lydia stepped forward, her hands clenched at her sides. I don't owe you anything. The house was taken 2 years ago. Ridley smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made her skin crawl. Interest accrues, Mrs. Hale. You signed the deed. That makes you liable. I didn't sign anything. Your husband did. And when he died, the debt passed to you. That's not how it works. It is if the contract says so. Ridley pulled a folded paper from his coat and held it up. I have the documentation right here. You owe $300, plus fees. Lydia's vision blurred. $300. She didn't have $3. She doesn't have it, Ethan said, his voice flat. Then she'll have to work it off. Ridley's eyes slid over Lydia in a way that made her want to disappear. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement. No. Excuse me? I said no. Ethan stepped off the porch, moving between Ridley and Lydia. She's not going anywhere with you. Ridley's smile thinned. This is a legal matter, Mr. Crowley, and I don't care if it's legal or not. She's staying here. Then you'll be harboring a debtor. That's a crime. So arrest me. Ridley's jaw tightened. He looked past Ethan to Lydia. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Mrs. Hale. Come with me now, and we'll settle this quietly. Stay here, and I'll be back with the sheriff. Lydia's heart hammered. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ethan spoke first. Let him come. Ridley stared at him. You're serious? As stone. For a long moment, Ridley didn't move. Then he folded the paper, tucked it back into his coat, and mounted his horse. You'll regret this, he said. Doubt it. Ridley turned his horse and rode out of the clearing, his coat flaring behind him like a crow's wing. Lydia stood frozen, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Ethan turned to her, his expression calm but his eyes hard. He won't stop, she said. He'll bring the sheriff. They'll take me back. They won't. You don't know that. I know you're not going back. Ethan's voice was firm, final. Not unless you want to. Lydia shook her head, her hands trembling. I can't ask you to fight my battles. You're not asking. I'm choosing. Why? Because it's right. She stared at him. This man who kept choosing her without hesitation, without conditions, and something inside her cracked open further. I don't know how to let you do this. she whispered. Then just don't stop me. Clara appeared in the doorway, June behind her. Is he gone? He's gone, Ethan said, but he'll be back. What do we do? Clara asked. Ethan looked at Lydia. We get ready. Ethan didn't waste time. Within an hour of Ridley's departure, he'd saddled his horse and ridden into town, leaving Lydia with Clara and June and instructions to bolt the door if anyone came. Lydia paced the cabin, her mind spinning through possibilities, each one darker than the last. She imagined the sheriff arriving with a warrant. Imagined being dragged back to Ember Crossing in chains. Imagined Ethan paying the price for defending her. Clara sat at the table, sharpening a kitchen knife with steady, deliberate strokes. June watched from the corner, her doll clutched tight against her chest. He'll fix it, Clara said, without looking up. You don't know that. Yes, I do. He always does. Lydia stopped pacing. What if he can't this time? Clara set down the whetstone and met Lydia's eyes. Then we'll figure something else out, but running won't help. I'm not running. You're thinking about it. Lydia looked away. Clara was right. She'd been calculating distances, mapping roads in her mind, planning exits, old habits, survival patterns carved deep into her bones. I don't want to bring trouble to this house, Lydia said quietly. Trouble's already here. Has been since the day we showed up. Clara resumed sharpening the knife. Mr. Crowley doesn't care. He says some things are worth the fight. And you believe him? Always have. June spoke up from the corner, her voice small but certain. You're worth fighting for. Lydia's throat closed. She crossed to the window and stared out at the clearing, at the trees standing sentinel in the fading light. She thought about Samuel, about the house they'd lost, about the debt she'd never known existed until it came hunting her. She thought about Thomas Ridley's eyes, the way they'd moved over her like she was livestock to be appraised. She thought about Ethan stepping between them without hesitation. The sun was setting when hoofbeats sounded again. Lydia's pulse spiked, but Clara was already at the window. It's him, she said, relief evident in her voice. Ethan dismounted and tied his horse, then came inside carrying a leather satchel. His face was tight, his jaw set, but his eyes were clear. He set the satchel on the table and looked at Lydia. Ridley's contract is fake, he said. Lydia blinked. What? I went to the land office, talked to the clerk. Your husband never signed any contract with Thomas Ridley. The house was seized for unpaid taxes, but the debt was settled when the property transferred. Ridley's trying to collect on something that doesn't exist. But he had papers. Forgeries, good ones apparently. He's done this before, targets widows, people with no resources to fight back, shows them fake documents and collects whatever he can scare out of them. Ethan's expression darkened. The clerk said 3 other women have paid him in the last year alone. Lydia sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. So I don't owe him anything, not a cent. But he'll come back anyway. Probably. Men like that don't quit easy. Ethan opened the satchel and pulled out a folder. So I got you this. He handed her the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, stamped and signed, declaring that all debts associated with the property formerly owned by Samuel and Lydia Hale had been satisfied in full upon transfer of title to the county. It's official, Ethan said. You're clear. Lydia stared at the document, her vision blurring. How did you get this so fast? The clerk owed me a favor, and he doesn't like Ridley any more than I do. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat across from her. When Ridley comes back, you show him that. If he keeps pushing, we go to the sheriff together. Ridley's the one breaking the law, not you. The sheriff won't care. He's friends with half the men in town. Maybe, but he's not friends with Judge Halloran, and the judge doesn't tolerate fraud. Ethan's voice was calm, steady. We've got the law on our side now. That counts for something. Lydia looked at him, this man who'd spent his afternoon fighting a battle that wasn't his, who'd called in favors and faced down bureaucracy on behalf of someone the world had already written off. Why do you keep doing this? She asked, her voice breaking. Because you matter, Ethan said simply, and because no one should have to face this alone. Clara set the knife aside and came to stand beside Lydia. She didn't say anything, just rested her hand on Lydia's shoulder. June crossed the room and did the same on the other side. Lydia closed her eyes and let the tears come. They waited 3 days. Ethan kept his routine, chopping wood, checking traps, tending the small garden behind the cabin, but Lydia could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes tracked movement at the tree line. Clara and June stayed close to the house, their usual chatter muted. Lydia tried to help, tried to keep busy, but every sound made her flinch. On the 4th day, Ridley returned. This time he brought 2 men with him, both large, both armed. They rode into the clearing just after dawn, and Ethan met them on the porch with his rifle resting in the crook of his arm. "Mr. Crowley," Ridley said, his voice dripping false courtesy, "I believe we have unfinished business." "We don't." "Mrs. Hale still owes—" "Mrs. Hale doesn't owe you anything." Ethan's voice was flat, hard as iron. "And if you set foot on this property again, I'll have you arrested for fraud and harassment." Ridley's smile froze. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a fact. I've got documentation from the county land office proving your contract is fake. I've also got testimony from 3 other women you've extorted. So unless you want to explain that to Judge Halloran, I suggest you turn around and ride out." One of Ridley's men shifted in his saddle, his hand moving toward his gun. Ethan didn't move the rifle, but his finger slid to the trigger guard. "Don't," Ethan said quietly. The man froze. Ridley's jaw worked, his eyes darting between Ethan and the cabin. Lydia stood just inside the doorway, Clara and June behind her, the folder with the official document clutched in her hands. "You're making a mistake," Ridley said. "No," Ethan replied. "You did. When you came here." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Ridley jerked his reins, turning his horse. "This isn't over." "Yes, it is." Ridley spurred his horse and rode out, his men following. They disappeared into the trees and the clearing fell silent except for the wind moving through the pines. Ethan lowered the rifle and turned to Lydia. "You all right?" She nodded, though her hands were shaking. "Is he really gone?" "For now, maybe for good, if he's smart." Ethan leaned the rifle against the porch rail. "But if he comes back, we'll handle it." Clara stepped forward, her face pale but determined. "What if he brings more men?" "Then we get the sheriff involved, or the judge." Ethan looked at Lydia. "But my guess is he won't. Men like Ridley work in shadows. They don't hold up well in daylight." Lydia wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this was truly over, but years of watching hope curdle into disappointment had taught her to be cautious. "What if you're wrong?" she asked. Ethan met her eyes. "Then we'll deal with it. Together." That word again, together. As if it were the simplest thing in the world. As if she weren't still waiting for the moment when his patience ran out and he realized she was more trouble than she was worth. But he didn't look like a man on the verge of giving up. He looked like a man who'd planted his feet and had no intention of moving. The days that followed were quieter. Ridley didn't return. The town didn't send anyone else. Slowly, the tension in the cabin eased. Claire and June resumed their usual routines, helping with chores, playing invented games, reading aloud from their battered book. Ethan went back to his work, and Lydia found herself settling into rhythms she hadn't realized she'd been building. She woke before dawn and started the fire. Made coffee, kneaded dough for bread. The work felt good, purposeful. She wasn't just occupying space anymore. She was contributing, creating, and no one told her she was doing it wrong. One morning, she found a bolt of fabric on the table, simple calico, nothing fancy, but new. Ethan stood by the window, pretending to examine the weather. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "Town. Figured you might want to make something. For yourself, I mean." Lydia ran her fingers over the fabric. It had been years since she'd sewn anything that wasn't a patch or a repair. "I don't know what to make." "Whatever you want." She looked at him. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." "Then why?" "Because I wanted to." He turned to face her, his expression open. "You've been wearing Clara's old dress for weeks. Thought you might like something that's yours." Lydia's chest tightened. "Thank you." He nodded and left her standing there, the fabric soft under her hands, her mind already turning over possibilities. She spent the next week sewing. It had been so long that her fingers fumbled at first, the stitches uneven, the seams crooked. But Clara sat with her, offering quiet suggestions, and slowly the pieces came together. A simple dress, nothing elaborate, but well made, sturdy, hers. When she finished it, she changed behind the curtain and stepped out. June clapped her hands. Clara smiled. Ethan looked up from the chair he was repairing and nodded. "Looks good," he said. "It's crooked at the hem," Lydia said, smoothing the fabric. "Didn't notice." She sat at the table feeling strange and self-conscious and oddly proud. This dress was hers. She'd made it. No one had given it to her out of pity or obligation. She'd created it with her own hands. It was such a small thing, but it felt enormous. That evening, after supper, Ethan pulled out a map and spread it on the table. Clara and June leaned in, fascinated, while Lydia hung back. "What's this for?" Clara asked. "Winter's coming," Ethan said. "We'll need more supplies. I'm planning a trip to Laramie next month. Figured I'd see if there's anything special you all want." "Peppermints," June said immediately. Clara rolled her eyes. "Books. Real ones. Not the same one we've read 100 times." Ethan looked at Lydia. "What about you?" She hesitated. "I don't need anything." Didn't ask what you needed, asked what you wanted. Lydia thought about it, about all the things she'd gone without, all the small comforts she'd stopped letting herself imagine. "Thread," she said finally. "Good thread. And maybe needles that aren't bent." Ethan made a note on a scrap of paper. "Done." "You don't have to—" "I know, but I'm going anyway, so I might as well bring back what you need." He folded the map. "Anything else?" Lydia shook her head, but something warm unfurled in her chest. He'd asked, he'd listened, he'd written it down like it mattered, like she mattered. The next Sunday, Clara convinced Lydia to walk with them to the creek. The weather was still warm, though the nights were beginning to cool, and the water ran clear and cold over smooth stones. June waded in up to her knees, shrieking with laughter, while Clara sat on the bank and plaited grass into loose braids. Lydia stood at the edge, her shoes off, her feet bare for the first time in weeks. The scars from the blisters had faded to pale lines, barely visible now. She stepped into the water, gasping at the cold, and felt the current tug gently at her ankles. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Clara said. "Yes," Lydia admitted. June splashed toward her, grinning. "Come deeper." "I'm fine here." "You're scared." "I'm cautious." June laughed and splashed her anyway, sending droplets arcing through the sunlight. Lydia yelped, then, before she could think better of it, splashed back. June shrieked with delight, and soon they were both laughing, water flying, the sound of it bright and reckless. Clara joined in, and for a few wild minutes the three of them were just people playing in a creek, untouched by the weight of the past or the uncertainty of the future. When they finally collapsed on the bank, breathless and soaked, Lydia lay back in the grass and stared up at the sky. The clouds drifted slow and lazy, and the sun was warm on her face. "This is nice," she said quietly. "It is," Clara agreed. June rolled onto her side, propping her head on her hand. "Do you think you'll stay forever?" Lydia's breath caught. "I don't know." "I hope you do." "Me too," Clara said. Lydia looked at them, these two girls who'd stopped men twice their size without flinching, who'd welcomed her into their home like she'd always belonged, and felt something shift inside her. "I hope so too," she said. That night, Lydia couldn't sleep again. She lay in the narrow bed, listening to Clara and June breathe, and thought about what June had asked. Stay forever, as if it were possible, as if she could build a life here that wouldn't eventually crumble. She rose and went outside, wrapping herself in the blanket Ethan had given her weeks ago. The stars were bright, scattered across the sky like salt spilled on a dark table. She sat on the porch steps and let the night settle around her. The door opened. Ethan stepped out, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed her one and sat beside her. "Can't sleep?" he asked. "Too much in my head." He nodded, sipping his coffee. They sat in silence for a while, and then Lydia said, "June asked if I was going to stay forever." "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know." Ethan was quiet. Then he said, "Do you want to?" Lydia gripped the cup, feeling the warmth seep into her palms. "I don't know if I'm allowed to want that." "Why not?" "Because wanting things has only ever gotten me hurt." Ethan turned to look at her, his face shadowed but his eyes clear. "That's not a reason to stop wanting." "It feels safer." "Maybe." But it's not living. Lydia looked at him. What if I stay and it doesn't work? What if I mess this up? Then we figure it out, same as we've been doing. His voice was steady, certain. You don't have to be perfect, Lydia. You just have to be here. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that she could stay, that this fragile, precious thing they'd built wouldn't shatter the moment she let herself need it. I'm afraid, she admitted. I know. Does that bother you? No. Ethan set his cup down and leaned back on his hands. Fear makes sense. You've been hurt. You've lost things. Of course you're afraid. He paused. But don't let fear make your decisions for you. Lydia stared up at the stars, at the vast, indifferent sky, and thought about all the times she'd chosen safety over hope, all the times she'd walked away before she could be pushed. What if I don't know how to choose differently? She asked. Then you practice. One day at a time. He looked at her. And you let people help you. That's part of it too. She met his eyes, and the steadiness there, the quiet, unshakable belief that she was worth the effort, made her chest ache. I want to stay, she said, the words barely a whisper. Then stay. It's that simple? It's that simple. Lydia nodded, and something inside her unclenched. Not completely, not yet, but enough that she could breathe a little easier. Okay, she said. Okay. I'll stay. Ethan smiled, small, genuine, warm. Good. They sat together in the dark, drinking coffee and watching the stars, and for the first time in years, Lydia let herself imagine a future that didn't end in loss. The weeks blurred into a new kind of normal. Lydia sewed another dress, mended Ethan's shirts, helped Clara teach June her letters. She learned the rhythms of the cabin, when to stoke the fire, when to start supper, when to leave Ethan alone with his thoughts, and when to sit beside him in companionable silence. She learned that Clara had nightmares sometimes, that June was afraid of thunderstorms, that Ethan's silence wasn't coldness, but simply the way he processed the world. And they learned her. Learned that she hated loud voices, that she needed time alone in the mornings, that she could cook almost anything but couldn't bake to save her life. It wasn't perfect. There were hard days, days when the grief rose up and swallowed her whole, when she couldn't get out of bed, when the weight of everything she'd lost pressed so hard she couldn't breathe. But on those days, Clara brought her tea. June sat beside her and hummed. Ethan chopped wood within earshot and didn't ask questions. They let her be broken without demanding she fix herself. And slowly, imperceptibly, she began to heal. One evening in late October, as the first frost crept across the ground and the air smelled of smoke and coming snow, Lydia stood at the window and watched Ethan teach June how to stack firewood properly. Clara was beside her kneading dough, her hands dusted with flour. You look happy, Clara said. Lydia glanced at her surprised. Do I? Yes, different than when you first came. Clara shaped the dough into a round loaf. Lighter. Lydia thought about it, about the woman who'd been dragged through the street, silent and defeated, about the woman who'd sat on this porch weeks ago, afraid to want anything. I think I am, she said quietly. Good. Clara set the dough aside to rise. You deserve to be. Outside, June burst into laughter as a log tumbled off the stack. Ethan caught it before it hit the ground and handed it back to her, saying something Lydia couldn't hear. June nodded seriously and placed it more carefully. Lydia smiled. This quiet, ordinary evening was what home felt like, and she was finally letting herself believe it could last. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the mountains with a vengeance that turned the world white and silent. The first real snow fell in mid-November, thick and heavy, blanketing the clearing and muffling all sound except the occasional crack of a branch giving way under the weight. Lydia woke to find frost etched across the inside of the windows in delicate patterns, and when she stepped outside to fetch water, the cold bit through her shawl and stole her breath. Ethan had prepared well. The woodpile stood taller than Lydia, neatly stacked and covered with canvas. The root cellar was packed with potatoes, carrots, turnips, and jars of preserves Clara and June had helped put up in the fall. Smoked venison hung from the rafters, and sacks of flour and cornmeal lined the back wall. They had enough to last until spring, maybe longer if they were careful. The cabin felt smaller with all of them inside more often, but it wasn't oppressive. They developed rhythms. Ethan spent mornings checking the traps he'd set in the woods, returning with rabbits or the occasional fox. Lydia cooked, mended, and worked on a quilt she'd started from scraps of fabric, a project that kept her hands busy during the long afternoons. Clara taught June arithmetic using dried beans as counters, and in the evenings they all gathered by the fire while Ethan read aloud from a book of frontier tales he'd bought on his trip to Laramie. Lydia had been skeptical about the trip, about him leaving for 3 days, about being alone with the girls, about trusting that he'd come back. But he had, arriving just before sunset on the 3rd day with supplies, peppermints for June, 2 new books for Clara, and a small wooden box for Lydia containing thread in 6 different colors, a packet of good needles, and a thimble made of actual silver. She'd stared at the thimble, turning it over in her hands, and when she looked up, Ethan was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "It's too much," she'd said. "It's a thimble. It's silver. So use it." He'd turned away to unpack the rest of the supplies, effectively ending the conversation, but Lydia had seen the faint smile at the corner of his mouth. She used the thimble every day after that, and every time she did, she thought about the fact that someone had cared enough to buy her something beautiful. One morning in early December, Lydia woke to find Clara standing at the window, her breath fogging the glass, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" Lydia asked, pushing herself up. "Look." Lydia crossed to the window. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, and in the pristine white surface of the clearing, a line of tracks led from the tree line to the cabin and back again. Boot prints. Human. Too large to be a woman's, too deliberate to be accidental. Ethan was already awake, crouched by the fireplace, feeding logs into the coals. He glanced up when Lydia approached. "Someone was here last night," she said quietly, keeping her voice low so June wouldn't wake. "I know. Saw them from the window around midnight." Lydia's stomach clenched. "Did you see who it was?" "Too dark, but they didn't try the door, didn't approach the cabin, just walked the perimeter and left." "That's not comforting." "No," Ethan agreed. He stood, brushing ash from his hands. "But it's not necessarily a threat either. Could have been a trapper, someone lost, maybe even a drifter looking for shelter who thought better of it. Or it could have been Ridley." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Could have been." Clara moved away from the window, her arms wrapped around herself. "What do we do?" "Same as always," Ethan said. "Stay alert. Keep the doors locked at night. I'll set some bells on the trail. If anyone comes close, we'll hear them." Lydia wanted to argue, to insist they do more. But what more was there? They were 3 miles from town, surrounded by wilderness, with winter closing in. Running wasn't an option. Hiding wasn't either. So they stayed alert. Ethan strung bells on thin wire along the main trail and the 2 smaller paths that led to the cabin. He kept his rifle closer, propped by the door instead of hung above it. At night, he slept lighter, waking at every creak and groan of the cabin settling. Lydia found herself watching the tree line during the day, her nerves stretched tight as bowstrings. She hated it, hated feeling hunted again, hated the way fear crept back into the spaces she'd worked so hard to clear. But nothing happened. Days passed. The tracks were covered by new snow, and no fresh ones appeared. The bells stayed silent. Slowly, the tension eased. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, a different kind of visitor arrived. Lydia was kneading bread when she heard the bells. Her hands stilled, flour dusting her knuckles, and she looked up sharply. Ethan was already moving toward the rifle, his expression calm but focused. Clara pulled June away from the window. "Stay inside," Ethan said, then stepped out onto the porch. Lydia moved to the window, her heart pounding. A figure emerged from the trees, small, bundled in layers, moving slowly through the snow. Not a man. A woman. And she was alone. Ethan lowered the rifle slightly, but didn't set it down. "Can I help you?" The woman stopped at the edge of the clearing. She was older, maybe 60, with gray hair visible beneath a wool scarf and a face lined by weather and worry. She raised one hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm looking for Lydia Hale," she called, her voice thin but steady. Lydia's breath caught. She opened the door and stepped out beside Ethan, ignoring his sharp look. "I'm Lydia Hale." The woman's shoulders sagged with relief. "Thank the heavens. I was afraid I had the wrong place." She took a few steps closer, her boots crunching in the snow. "My name is Margaret Poole. I run a boarding house in Ember Crossing. We've met before, though I don't expect you to remember. It was years ago, at the church social." Lydia had a vague memory of a woman with kind eyes and a quick smile, but the details were hazy. "What do you want?" "To talk, if you'll allow it." Margaret glanced at Ethan, then back to Lydia. "I won't take much of your time, I promise." Ethan looked at Lydia. "Your call." Lydia hesitated, then nodded. "Come inside. It's too cold to stand out here." Margaret followed them into the cabin, stamping snow from her boots at the threshold. Clara offered her a chair by the fire, and June brought her a cup of water. The woman accepted both with quiet thanks, her hands trembling slightly as she warmed them over the flames. "I'll be direct," Margaret said after a moment. "I came to apologize." Lydia blinked. "For what?" "For not helping you when you needed it. For watching them drag you through the street and doing nothing." Margaret's voice cracked. "I've carried that shame for months, Mrs. Hale. I should have stepped in, should have said something, and I didn't." Lydia didn't know what to say. She'd spent so long believing the entire town had abandoned her that the idea of someone carrying guilt over it felt surreal. "Why now?" she asked. "Because I can't live with it anymore." Margaret set the cup down, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "And because I wanted you to know that not everyone in Ember Crossing thinks you deserved what happened. Some of us were just too cowardly to stand up when it mattered. That doesn't change anything." "No, it doesn't." Margaret met her eyes. "But I wanted you to know anyway. And I wanted to tell you that Thomas Ridley left town 3 weeks ago. The judge heard about his schemes and issued a warrant. He's gone, Mrs. Hale. He can't hurt you anymore." The words hit Lydia like a physical blow. Ridley was gone. The threat that had haunted her, that had made her flinch at every shadow, was gone. "Are you sure?" Ethan asked. "Positive. Judge Halloran made an example of him, fined him everything he had, and told him if he ever set foot in the county again, he'd be arrested on sight." Margaret's expression softened. "You're safe, at least from him." Lydia sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. Safe. The word felt foreign, impossible. "Why did you come all this way to tell me that?" she asked. "Because I thought you deserved to hear it from someone who cared." Margaret stood, pulling her scarf tighter. "And because I wanted to invite you to Christmas dinner at my boarding house, you and your family." She gestured to Ethan and the girls, and Lydia realized with a start that Margaret assumed they were hers, her family. The thought sent a strange warmth through her chest. "I don't think that's a good idea," Lydia said quietly. "Why not?" "Because the people in that town made it very clear I wasn't welcome." "Some of them did, not all." Margaret's voice was firm. "And those of us who stayed silent need to see you living well, need to see that you survived in spite of us. It's the least we owe you." Lydia looked at Ethan. He met her gaze, his expression unreadable, and said nothing. The choice was hers. "I'll think about it," Lydia said finally. Margaret nodded. "That's all I ask." She moved toward the door, then paused. "You look well, Mrs. Hale. Happier than I've ever seen you. I'm glad." She left before Lydia could respond, her figure disappearing into the trees. Lydia stood at the window long after Margaret was gone, her mind churning. Ethan came to stand beside her, his presence solid and quiet. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I don't know if I can go back there." "You don't have to." "But maybe I should." She turned to look at him. "Maybe she's right. Maybe they need to see that they didn't break me." "Is that why you'd go? To prove something to them?" Lydia thought about it. "No, I think I'd go to prove something to myself." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we'll go." "You don't have to. I know, but you're not walking into that town alone." Clara stepped forward, her chin set in that stubborn way Lydia had come to recognize. "We're all going." June nodded, clutching her doll. "We're family." Lydia's throat tightened. Family. They kept saying it like it was fact, like it was already decided, and every time they did, the word felt a little less impossible. All right, she said. We'll go. The days leading up to Christmas were a flurry of preparation. Clara and June insisted on making gifts for Margaret and anyone else who might be at the dinner. They spent hours crafting small ornaments from pine cones and ribbon, their faces serious with concentration. Lydia baked bread and a dried apple cake, packing them carefully in a basket. Ethan said nothing about gifts, but Lydia caught him carving something small by the fire one evening, his knife moving with careful precision. On Christmas Eve, Lydia stood in front of the small mirror Ethan had hung by the wash basin and studied her reflection. She wore the dress she'd sewn, her hair pinned neatly, her face still too thin but no longer hollow. She looked like a woman who'd survived something. She looked like someone who was still standing. "You ready?" Ethan asked from the doorway. "No, but I'm going anyway." He smiled faintly. "That's the spirit." They set out mid-morning, the wagon loaded with gifts and food, the girls bundled in quilts in the back. The snow had stopped, and the sky was a pale, brittle blue. The town appeared on the horizon like a cluster of dark shapes against the white, and Lydia's pulse quickened. She hadn't been back since the day they dragged her out. Ethan must have sensed her tension because he reached over and took her hand. His grip was warm, steady, and she held on tighter than she meant to. "You don't have to prove anything," he said quietly. "I know, but I want to do this." "Then I'm right here." They arrived at Margaret's boarding house just after noon. The building was modest but well kept, with smoke curling from the chimney and wreaths hung on the windows. Margaret met them at the door, her face lighting up when she saw them. "You came," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Lydia admitted. Inside, the boarding house was warm and smelled of roasted meat and baking bread. A long table had been set in the dining room, and several people were already seated, faces Lydia recognized but didn't know well. They looked up when she entered, and the room went quiet. Lydia lifted her chin and met their stares. Margaret cleared her throat. "Everyone, this is Lydia Hale and her family. They'll be joining us for dinner." One by one, the faces turned away, back to their conversations. Not welcoming, exactly, but not hostile either. Just indifferent. And somehow, that was enough. Dinner was awkward at first. Lydia sat between Clara and Ethan, hyper-aware of every glance, every whisper. But as the meal progressed and the food was passed and the conversation flowed, the tension eased. June charmed an older woman with stories about her doll. Clara discussed books with a young man who worked at the general store. Ethan spoke little, but his presence beside Lydia was a constant grounding weight. And Lydia ate. She listened. She even laughed once when Margaret told a story about a goat that had escaped and terrorized the town for 3 days. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't reconciliation. But it was a step. A small, fragile step toward something that looked almost like peace. After dinner, Margaret pulled Lydia aside. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I meant what I said before. You deserve better than what this town gave you." Margaret's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I hope you found it." Lydia glanced across the room to where Ethan stood talking quietly with Clara and June, his hand resting lightly on June's shoulder. "I think I have," she said softly. They left as the sun was setting, the sky streaked with orange and pink. The girls fell asleep in the back of the wagon, and Lydia sat beside Ethan, her head resting against his shoulder. He didn't say anything, just kept the horses steady on the road home. When they reached the cabin, Ethan carried June inside while Clara stumbled sleepily after him. Lydia stood in the clearing for a moment, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. She thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, broken, silent, dragged through the street like refuse. She thought about the woman she was now, still scarred, still healing, but no longer convinced she was worthless. The door opened and Ethan stepped out. "You coming in?" "In a minute." He came to stand beside her, his breath misting in the cold air. "You did good today." "It was hard." "I know, but I'm glad I went." "Me too." They stood in silence, and then Lydia said, "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About staying, really staying, not just until I figure out what's next, but permanently." She turned to look at him. "If that's all right?" Ethan's expression softened. "More than all right." I don't have much to offer. You have you. That's more than enough. Lydia's chest ached with something that felt suspiciously like hope. I'm still afraid. That's okay. Fear doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. What if I mess this up? Then we'll fix it, together. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You're not alone anymore, Lydia. You don't have to carry everything by yourself. She looked down at their joined hands, at the way his fingers curled around hers like it was the most natural thing in the world, and something inside her finally, fully broke open. Not shattered, opened, like a door she'd kept locked for too long, finally swinging wide. Okay, she whispered. Okay? I'm staying, for good. Ethan smiled, really smiled, wide and genuine and so full of warmth it made her eyes sting. Good. He pulled her into a hug and Lydia let herself be held, let herself lean into the solid strength of him, let herself believe that this fragile, precious thing they'd built, could last. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled. Clara and June slept peacefully in their beds, and for the first time in years, Lydia Hale felt like she'd come home. The winter deepened, and with it came a quiet that felt less like isolation and more like sanctuary. The world outside the cabin became a blur of white and gray, the snow piling high against the walls, the wind howling through the pines. But inside, life continued in its gentle rhythms. Lydia finished the quilt and draped it over the bed she shared with the girls, a patchwork of colors and patterns that told the story of everything she'd mended and salvaged and made new. Clara read through both her new books twice and started a third time, this time reading aloud to June and teaching her the harder words. Ethan carved a set of wooden animals for June and a small box with a hinged lid for Clara, who filled it immediately with treasures. Smooth stones, bird feathers, a button she'd found in the road. And slowly, imperceptibly, the space between Lydia and Ethan shifted. It started with small things. His hand at the small of her back when she reached for something on a high shelf. Her fingers brushing his when they both reached for the coffee pot. The way their eyes met across the room and held, just a second longer than necessary. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither of them pushed. But it was there, humming quietly beneath everything else, waiting. One evening in late January, after the girls had gone to bed, Lydia sat by the fire working on a new sewing project. A shirt for Ethan, though she hadn't told him yet. He sat across from her, mending a harness, his hands steady and sure. Can I ask you something? Lydia said. Always. Why did you never marry? Before, I mean. Ethan's hands stilled. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Never found someone I wanted to build a life with. Never? There were women, a few, but none of them felt right. He set the harness aside. I spent a long time just surviving. Didn't seem fair to ask someone to share that. And now? Now I'm not just surviving anymore. His gaze was steady. Now I'm living. And that changes things. Lydia's pulse quickened. Changes them how? Ethan stood and crossed to her, crouching so they were eye level. I think you know how. She did. She'd known for weeks, maybe longer, but hearing him say it, seeing it in his eyes, made it real. I'm still broken, she said quietly. So am I. I don't know if I can be what you need. You already are. Ethan, Lydia. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm just asking if you'd let me stand beside you, for as long as you'll have me. Her eyes burned. What if I let you down? You won't. But even if you did, I'd still be here. She stared at him, this man who'd chosen her again and again without hesitation, who'd given her space to heal and time to breathe and a place to belong. And she realized she didn't want to be afraid anymore. Yes, she said. Yes? Yes, I'll let you stand beside me. I want you to. Ethan's smile was slow, warm, like sunrise breaking over mountains. He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, and they stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, the fire crackling softly beside them. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were bright. Good. Good, she echoed. He stood and pulled her to her feet, and then slowly, carefully, giving her every chance to pull away, he kissed her. It was soft, gentle, a question and an answer all at once, and when Lydia kissed him back, it felt like coming home. They didn't tell Clara and June right away. There was nothing official to announce, no grand declaration. Things simply shifted, settled into a new configuration that felt as natural as breathing. Ethan's hand found Lydia's more often. She leaned into him when they sat by the fire. At night, after the girls were asleep, they talked in low voices about small things and large ones, about the past that had shaped them and the future they were building together. Spring came slowly, reluctantly, the snow melting in patches to reveal brown grass and mud. The creek swelled with runoff, rushing loud and wild over its banks. Birds returned, filling the mornings with song, and the air lost its sharp edge, warming degree by degree until Lydia could step outside without her shawl. Clara noticed first, of course. She had always been observant, her gray eyes missing nothing. One morning in early March, she watched Ethan brush a strand of hair from Lydia's face, watched the way Lydia smiled up at him, and she grinned. "Finally," she said. Lydia looked at her, startled. "Finally what?" "You two figured it out." Clara poured herself a cup of water, still smiling. "Took you long enough." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You have an opinion on this?" "June and I have had opinions for months." Clara glanced toward the corner where June was playing with her wooden animals. "We were starting to think you'd never notice each other." June looked up. "Does this mean you're getting married?" Lydia's breath caught. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We haven't talked about that," Lydia said carefully. "Why not?" June tilted her head. "You love each other, don't you?" The question hung in the air, simple and impossible and true. Lydia's heart pounded against her ribs. "Yes," Ethan said quietly, his eyes never leaving Lydia's face. "I do." Lydia's throat tightened. The word felt huge, terrifying, and she'd avoided thinking it for weeks, afraid that naming it would somehow break the spell. But now it was spoken, and there was no taking it back. "I love you too," she said, her voice barely a whisper. June beamed. Clara looked satisfied. Ethan's expression softened into something so tender it made Lydia's chest ache. "So," Clara said, practical as ever. "When's the wedding?" Ethan laughed, low and warm. "Let's not rush things." "Why not? You're both old." "Clara," Lydia said, caught between mortification and laughter. "What? You are. If you wait too long, you'll be ancient." "We're not even 30 yet," Ethan said, amused. "That's what I said. Old." Clara picked up her book. "But it's your choice. Just don't take another 6 months to decide." She wandered outside, leaving Lydia and Ethan staring at each other across the table. June went back to her animals, humming softly. "She has a point," Ethan said after a moment. "About us being old?" "About not waiting." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I know it's fast. I know we've only been, whatever this is, for a couple months. But I also know I want to spend the rest of my life with you. So if you're willing, I'd like to make it official." Lydia's heart hammered. "You're asking me to marry you?" "I am. In front of June." Seemed like as good a time as any. Lydia laughed, the sound shaky and bright. She looked at him. This man who'd saved her, who'd given her space to heal, who'd loved her without conditions or expectations, who'd seen her at her worst and stayed anyway. "Yes," she said. Ethan's smile could have lit the entire cabin. "Yes?" "Yes, I'll marry you." June let out a whoop and launched herself at Lydia, nearly knocking her out of her chair. Clara appeared in the doorway, grinning like she'd orchestrated the whole thing. "Told you," she said. "Finally." They were married in April, in the clearing in front of the cabin with Margaret Poole and a handful of others from town as witnesses. Lydia wore a new dress she'd sewn herself, simple white cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Clara and June wove wildflowers into her hair, their faces serious with concentration. Ethan wore his best shirt and trousers, his hair neatly combed, his hand steady as he took Lydia's. Judge Halloran performed the ceremony, his voice carrying across the clearing as he spoke about commitment and partnership and building a life together. Lydia barely heard the words. She was too focused on Ethan's face, on the way he looked at her like she was something precious and rare. When the judge pronounced them married, Ethan kissed her, soft and sure and full of promise, and Clara and June cheered. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. The small gathering applauded, and Lydia Hale became Lydia Crowley. The name felt strange at first, unfamiliar on her tongue, but over the following weeks it settled, becoming hers in a way that felt right. She was no longer the woman the town had erased, no longer the widow dragged through the street. She was Lydia Crowley, wife to Ethan, mother in all but name to Clara and June. She was home. Life fell into new rhythms. Ethan expanded the garden and Lydia helped him plant rows of beans, squash, and corn. Clara took over most of the cooking, freeing Lydia to focus on sewing projects she'd been putting off. June learned to read well enough to get through simple stories on her own, though she still preferred when someone read to her. The cabin felt full in the best way, full of laughter and conversation and the comfortable silences that came with knowing someone deeply. Ethan and Lydia shared the larger bed now, and at night they talked until sleep claimed them, their voices low and intimate. "I never thought I'd have this," Lydia admitted one night, her head resting on Ethan's chest. "Have what?" "A family, a home, someone who chose me." She traced patterns on his shirt. "After Samuel died, I thought that part of my life was over. It was just waiting," Ethan said, "for the right people." "You really believe that?" "I have to. Otherwise, everything I went through before I found you was just suffering. I'd rather believe it was preparation." Lydia lifted her head to look at him. "Preparation for what?" "For knowing how to love you properly." His hand moved to cup her face. "For understanding what you needed when you showed up here broken and scared. For being patient enough to let you heal." Her eyes stung. "You make it sound intentional." "Maybe it was. Not by us, but by something. Fate, chance, whatever you want to call it." He kissed her forehead. "All I know is I'm grateful." "Me too," she whispered. Summer arrived with heat that shimmered off the ground and turned the clearing into a furnace by midday. They worked in the early mornings and late evenings, resting during the hottest hours. The garden flourished, producing more vegetables than they could eat. Lydia learned to preserve them in jars. Working alongside Margaret, who rode out once a week to visit and teach her techniques she'd perfected over decades. Margaret had become a friend, one of the few people from town who treated Lydia without judgment or pity. She brought news, supplies, and occasionally gossip, though she was careful to keep it light. Thomas Ridley was arrested in Colorado, Margaret mentioned one afternoon while helping Lydia snap beans. Tried the same scheme on a widow there, only she had 3 sons and a shotgun. Didn't end well for him. Lydia looked up sharply. "Is he dead?" "No, in prison, 20 years from what I heard." Margaret smiled grimly. "He won't be troubling anyone for a long time." Lydia felt a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying lift from her shoulders. Ridley was truly gone. The threat that had haunted her was permanently removed. "Good," she said quietly. "More than good. It's justice." Margaret paused, then added, "The town's been talking about you, you know." "I'm sure they have. Not like before. They say you look happy. That Ethan's a good man. That those girls are lucky to have you." Margaret's eyes were kind. "Some of them feel guilty for how they treated you. Not all, but some." "And the others?" "The others don't matter." Margaret's voice was firm. "You don't owe them anything, Lydia. Not forgiveness, not acknowledgement, nothing. You've built a good life out here. That's all the vindication you need." Lydia thought about that conversation for days afterward. She realized Margaret was right. She didn't need the town's approval or apologies. She had everything she needed right here. In August, Clara turned 9. They celebrated with a cake Lydia managed not to burn, gifts carved and sewn with care, and an afternoon swimming in the creek. June presented Clara with a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself, and Clara hugged her so hard they both fell over laughing. Watching them, Lydia felt her chest swell with emotion. These girls had saved her as much as Ethan had. They'd shown her that she could be needed, wanted, loved, for exactly who she was. That evening, as they sat around the fire, Clara looked at Lydia with uncharacteristic seriousness. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said. "Of course." "Would it be all right if June and I called you Ma?" Lydia's breath stopped. She looked at Ethan, who was watching her steadily, then at June, whose eyes were wide and hopeful. "We don't have to," Clara added quickly. "If it's too much or if you're not comfortable." "No," Lydia interrupted, her voice thick. "I mean, yes, I'd like that, very much." June launched herself into Lydia's lap, wrapping her arms around her neck. "Ma," she said, testing the word. Then louder, delighted, "Ma!" Clara smiled, slower but no less warm. "Ma." Lydia held them both, tears streaming down her face, and felt something inside her click into place. This was what she'd been missing. This was what Samuel's death had stolen from her. Not just a husband, but the possibility of a family. And now she had one. Ethan caught her eye across the fire, and the love in his expression was so fierce and pure it took her breath away. "Thank you," she mouthed. He shook his head slightly, as if to say she had nothing to thank him for, but his smile said everything else. Fall came again, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. They harvested the garden, stored food for winter, and prepared the cabin for another season of cold. But this year, Lydia approached winter without fear. She had provisions, warmth, and people who loved her. One October afternoon, Lydia was hanging laundry when she saw riders approaching. Her stomach clenched instinctively, old fears rising, but then she recognized the lead horse. Margaret, accompanied by Judge Halloran and another man Lydia didn't know. Ethan came out of the barn, his expression cautious. "Judge." "Margaret, what brings you out here?" "Official business, I'm afraid," the judge said, dismounting. He was an older man with white hair and sharp eyes, known for his fairness and his intolerance of nonsense. "But good business, I think." The stranger dismounted as well. He was younger, maybe 40, with kind eyes and a nervous energy. "Mrs. Crowley? My name is David Hale. I believe I'm your late husband's cousin." Lydia stared at him. Samuel had mentioned cousins out east, but she'd never met them. "I don't understand." "May we sit?" the judge asked. "This will take some explaining." They gathered around the table inside, and the judge laid out several papers. "Mr. Hale here has been searching for you for nearly a year. He only recently learned of your whereabouts." David leaned forward, his expression earnest. "When Samuel died, none of us knew. We were estranged from that side of the family, and by the time news reached us, you'd already lost the house. I'm so sorry for what you went through." "Why are you here now?" Lydia asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Because Samuel's father, my uncle, passed away last winter. He left an estate, and Samuel was named as a beneficiary. Since Samuel is gone, his share passes to you." Lydia's mind reeled. How much? $15,000. The number was incomprehensible. Lydia looked at Ethan, who looked equally stunned. "That can't be right," she said. "It is." David pushed the papers toward her. "It's all documented. The judge has verified everything. The money is yours, Mrs. Crowley. You can do whatever you want with it." Lydia's hands shook as she picked up the papers. $15,000. More money than she could have earned in a lifetime. Enough to change everything. "There's no conditions?" Ethan asked, his voice careful. "None," the judge confirmed. "It's hers free and clear." David stood. "I know this is a lot to take in. I'll leave you to process it, but I wanted to deliver the news personally and apologize for not finding you sooner." He extended his hand to Lydia. "Samuel spoke of you in his letters. He loved you very much." Lydia shook his hand, tears welling. "Thank you." After they left, Lydia sat at the table staring at the papers while Ethan made coffee. Clara and June had been outside during the visit, and their voices drifted through the window as they played. "What are you thinking?" Ethan asked, setting a cup in front of her. "That this doesn't feel real." "It's real. $15,000, Ethan. We could buy land, build a bigger house, send the girls to a real school." Her mind raced with possibilities. "We could do anything." "We could," he agreed. "What do you want to do?" Lydia looked around the cabin, small, worn, but filled with love and life. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the woman she'd been, and the woman she'd become. I want to help people, she said slowly. People like me. Women who have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. Ethan sat across from her, listening. What if we bought land closer to town and built a house? A real house, big enough for multiple families, a place where women who've lost everything can stay while they figure out what's next. She looked at him. We could give them what you gave me, time, space, dignity. Ethan's expression softened. You want to create a refuge. Yes, is that foolish? No, it's exactly right. He took her hand. But it'll be hard work, and people will judge you for it. Let them. I'm done caring what people think. Lydia's voice was firm. I have the resources now to make a difference. I want to use them. Then we will. They spent the next months planning. Ethan and Lydia rode into town and purchased 10 acres on the northern edge of Ember Crossing, close enough for access but far enough for privacy. They hired builders and designed a house with separate living spaces, a communal kitchen, and a large garden. Margaret became their partner in the project, helping spread word and identify women who needed help. The first resident arrived in December, a young widow named Sarah with a baby and nothing else. She stayed through winter, helping with cooking and childcare, and by spring had saved enough money from sewing work to rent a small room in town. More women came. Some stayed weeks, others months. Each had her own story of loss and survival, and each left stronger than she'd arrived. Lydia and Ethan ran the refuge with quiet efficiency, providing shelter and support without judgment or conditions. Clara and June thrived, surrounded by other children and women who treated them like family. They helped with chores, played with babies, and learned that home wasn't just one place or one set of people. It was a feeling, a choice, a commitment. 2 years after the refuge opened, Lydia stood in the garden watching Clara teach a new resident how to plant tomatoes, while June entertained 3 toddlers with a story. Ethan came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. You did this, he said softly. We did this. You started it. You had the vision. Lydia leaned back against him, watching the life they'd built unfold in front of her. I never could have imagined this. When they were dragging me through that street, I thought my life was over. It was just beginning. I know that now. She turned in his arms to face him. Thank you for seeing me when no one else did. Thank you for letting me. He kissed her forehead. You saved me too, you know. How? You reminded me why I survived everything I went through, so I could be here, with you, building this. They stood together in the garden, surrounded by the sound of laughter and life, and Lydia felt a peace so complete it brought tears to her eyes. That evening, after everyone had eaten and the house had quieted, Clara approached Lydia with a letter. This came for you, she said. Lydia opened it. Inside was a note from Margaret and a newspaper clipping. The note read, Thought you'd want to see this. The clipping was from a Denver paper. It reported that Thomas Ridley had died in prison from illness, his schemes finally catching up with him in the form of violence from other inmates who learned what he'd done. Lydia read it twice, then folded it carefully and set it aside. Are you all right? Ethan asked. Yes. And she was. She felt no satisfaction in Ridley's death, no sense of victory, just a quiet acknowledgement that a chapter had truly closed. He can't hurt anyone anymore, she said. No, he can't. Lydia looked around the room, at Clara reading by lamplight, at June asleep on the sofa, at Ethan beside her, solid and steady. She thought about the refuge full of women rebuilding their lives, about the garden that would feed them all summer, about the future stretching out ahead of them. I'm happy, she said, surprised by the simplicity of it. Ethan smiled. Good. Really happy, not just surviving or getting by, actually deeply happy. You deserve to be. So do you. I am. He pulled her close. Every single day. They sat together as the fire burned low and the night settled around them, 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage and built something beautiful from the broken pieces. 5 years later, on a warm June evening, Lydia stood on the porch of the refuge and watched the sun set over the mountains. The house behind her was full. 8 women and 12 children currently in residence, each one working toward their own new beginning. Clara was 17 now, preparing to attend teachers' college in the fall. June was 12, all fierce determination and unstoppable curiosity. Ethan came out and handed her a cup of coffee. They stood in comfortable silence, shoulders touching. "Do you ever think about that day?" Lydia asked. "When you stopped them from dragging me out of town?" "Sometimes." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't?" "No." His voice was firm. "Because I did. And this is where we are." "This is where we are," Lydia echoed. Behind them, someone laughed. A baby cried, then quieted. Clara's voice rose, reading a story to the younger children. The house hummed with life, with hope, with the sound of people refusing to give up. Lydia thought about the woman she'd been, broken, silent, convinced she was worthless. She thought about the long, painful journey that had brought her here, about every moment of doubt and fear and desperate hope. And she thought about what Clara had said all those years ago, that first terrible, beautiful day. "You're worth fighting for." She'd believed it was a lie then, a kindness offered by children too young to know better. But it had been the truth. She was worth fighting for. She always had been. She just needed someone to show her. "Thank you," she said to Ethan, not for the first time and not for the last. "Always," he replied. And as the stars emerged one by one overhead and the night folded gently around them, Lydia Crowley, once Lydia Hale, once the woman the town erased, stood on her porch in the home she'd built and finally completely understood what it meant to belong. She was no longer the woman dragged through the street. She was the woman who'd risen from that dust, who'd claimed her worth, who'd built a refuge for others who needed to do the same. She was chosen. She was anchored. She was home. And that at long last was enough.